Hi, everybody. Welcome to World Building. My name is Rick Lovard. I'm the Program Director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange. Anne can't be with us today. She'll be back very soon at a future event. If you're unfamiliar with the Exchange, if you are a storyteller, you have a question about science as you're making a piece of mainstream media, you can call us and we will connect you to a field expert who can contextualize your question and speak to you on the topic. We've done over 3,500 consults since we opened our doors in 2008, including many feature films. I think we've done every Marvel film since Iron Man 2. So if you are a STEM professional, this is the first you're hearing about our work. Please do put your hand up in the air and contact us. Sachi will put some info down there below that so that you can reach out. We're always looking for volunteers, people who are interested in being connected to storytellers. You can find a recording of this show on our website or subscribe to the Science and Entertainment Exchange's YouTube channel to see events like this after the fact. If you're not watching it live, you can also sign up on our website to receive invites for these events and also for our weekly newsletter, The Collider. Unfortunately, for boring and technical reasons, this event won't be up this week. It'll be up on April 18th. So apologies for the delay in getting the video up, but it will be up. I want to thank our sponsors, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, without whose support we could not be doing these events. So thank you, Howard Hughes Medical Institute. We also get major funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and so many individual donors like you. If you gave for today's event, thank you so much. We do appreciate it. It goes right back into this programming and really lights on for us. So thank you. So today's event, we have 4 incredible speakers who are currently, and this is a fact, living in the future. We have limited time and more speakers than usual today. So I'm not going to give you an in-depth bio on everybody. You can find that on the event invite that you should have received if you're tuning in. I just got to say that the Gershenfeld's parents must have done something right because their kids, Neil, Joel, and Alan, are all entirely remarkable human beings. I also want to highlight Neil in particular because he was instrumental in the creation of the Exchange where I have worked for 13 years. So thank you so much, Neil, for that. I also want to say thank you to Alex Mcdowell in particular. As a founding member of our board, he and Neil have been critical members of our brain trusts for more than a decade. So I want to thank both of you for that. Also, I want to thank our discussants, Blair and Kimberlyn, for joining us on stage today. If you have a question at any point while our speakers are speaking, it's a little different format than usual. Our speakers will be speaking after a short video, but if at any point you have a question, you can put it right down here in the Q&A, and I will be dutifully making note and trying to get to as many questions as possible. We have an excruciatingly short Q&A period this time around. We'll get to as many questions as we possibly can at the end of the event. And then each of our speakers will have 1 minute for a closing comment at the end of the event. It's a little bit different than usual. My rabbit hole this week is the 8th largest Dutch city that was created with the future in mind at every step. The city planners also used a game to get input from the community on how the city should be developed. So I thought it was particularly relevant to today's conversation. So check out that link if you're interested in going a little deeper on that. And with that, we are going to watch a short video and then our speakers will be joining us on stage. So thank you, everybody. Here we go. Meche.
In 2000, when I designed Minority Report, the writer and I started on the same day. And so without a script, we had to develop a world. And that really changed my practice and launched world building as we know it. Minority Report became known for its accurate predictions of our present and future. It proved that imagining and portraying something that does not yet exist in the world was a way to actually enable it to exist in the world. We weren't being so clever, we were just listening well. If we're able to tell a convincing story that will immerse an audience in a completely different kind of outcome, and if we can thread this back into our present and reveal the steps we have to take as designers, as media makers, as educators, as manufacturers, as scientists, to shift direction and move towards that vision,
then maybe there's an opportunity here to re-engage the idea that storytelling actually changes the world.
Experimental is built on world-building design systems that are the foundation of our work. For industry, institutions, education and entertainment, it's a powerful engine for change in every medium and platform imaginable. So it's a great pleasure to be here at the event, particularly with my friends, the three Gershenfelds, but also to continue the conversation with Science and Entertainment Exchange, and incredibly important work they're doing. I started working in narrative design in 1975. I became a production designer in 1990, working in film. A quick thought that the production designer has always been a world builder. Production designer has to consider all of the options of a film until the camera starts rolling. We're in a 360-degree space. So I think that it's kind of intrinsic in what we do to do production design. But, with Minority Report, it changed radically. What was unusual was, as the video said, I started on the same day as the writer. And we had a half-page synopsis from Stephen, and the script didn't really come into place for several months. And we just had a basic provocation, which was the 50 years in the future. It's a benign world, and there are a group of precogs who have changed the situation in Washington, D.C. But the major provocation was from Stephen: this is not science fiction, it's future reality. And we were then forced to go outside the typical art department, film kind of relatively closed research space, and have to go out into the world, which is really where Neil comes in. Is, you know, he's largely to blame for what happened next. When we first met with Neil and a group of experts, I remember, and Neil will correct me if I'm wrong, that Neil said, I was reading the script on the plane. I'd never thought to consider precognition, but I think we can do it. And that idea that what we were doing could actually, by engaging in a kind of deep dive into reality projected forwards through the imagination, it led us directly to an amazing group of people, to MIT Media Lab, to all of the people that Neil introduced us to there, to Apple, to Lexus, to experts in advertising. And it was deeply and immediately the notion of world building kicked in. The other thing that happened, which I think is not necessarily so understood, is that we moved from being an almost completely analog production to being entirely digital. For example, this craft that Tom Cruise is standing on was built with rapid fabrication by Chrysler company in San Francisco. And Chrysler's, this was the first time they had ever had digital design input. They said that the only paper that was involved in the design was the purchase order. So we transitioned into an entirely digital component and flipped the model of production upside down. Then continuing to work in film, I was asked to do the Man of Steel, which was an amazing opportunity to sort of redesign the Superman logo, for one thing. But we asked a fundamental provocation, which was, why does Superman have an S on his chest? He's from Krypton, they don't speak English. And that emerged, that turned into sort of an analysis of what that S could mean, which became a sort of an idea that the S was a glyph amongst many glyphs. It also led to the idea that the curve was essential. There were no straight lines on Krypton. And so that sort of rolled into the idea that it was an organic world. We looked at Carl Blossfeld and the science of plants as a structural component, and biology as the fundamental driver of the aesthetic. But at some point, Zack Snyder, the director, asked us a complicated, difficult question, which was, what does the written language of Kryptonian look like? And so we brought in this linguist anthropologist from University of British Columbia, Christine Schreier, and spent 3 months developing an entire alphabet, and really dove into what linguistics and the the idea of writing, kind of transmitting the social politics. This was a object-based language rather than the person-based language. And if you have your Krypton dictionary with you during the movie, it's all real. The first sort of, well, one of the direct contacts with Science Entertainment Exchange as I moved into DreamWorks and started working in animation was the Bee Movie, a frivolous film about bees in Central Park. But we wanted to know about bee behavior, and we called Science Entertainment Exchange, talked to Anne Merchant, and were recommended an entomologist, a bee expert. And we said, I'm not sure how you can help. We're talking about bees who stand, wear clothes, and drive cars. But he found it an interesting challenge, and we learned a lot. We learned a lot about bee behavior, and it actually drove the way in which the waggle dance, for example, became a component in the narrative. The other film I have shown here in the bottom right is The Lawnmower Man. 1990, when it was the first film I worked on with an amazing director called Brett Leonard, who was deeply involved and engaged in Silicon Valley and new technologies, brought the idea of virtual reality to the script. And we immediately engaged. This is the first sort of public exposure ever to virtual reality. And we had to understand what it was capable of. It drove the narrative. And so we spent time with NASA, with a scientist called Scott Fisher. I wore very early and very huge, clunky piece of VR equipment with haptics, and moved around in a kind of 3D or 3-color 2D world, with the ability to reach out and touch something in a 2D world, transformative for me. And then that has led to working at USC and being deeply involved in VR and mixed reality since 2012. But I think just to come back full circle and pass over to Neil now to talk a little bit more about his engagement in Minority Report and how he pushed our science forward.
Oh, great. Thanks, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So my background started with just friend of a friend. I was advising some Hollywood movies. One of the interesting ones was Minority Report. Stephen didn't want to make it unless he could be convinced he could bring the authority to it he had brought to his earlier movies, the emotional authority, but now it was the authority of telling the future. And so we wanted to be convinced you could build the future. And so an amusing high point for me was giving a mini lesson in quantum mechanics to Steven Spielberg, where I explained non-locality and entanglement in bell pairs. And that's what led to the look and feel of the precogs. They're in a pond creating entanglement with the community around them. And it was a wonderful project. A lot of technology came out of it, like John Underkoffler turned the gestures in the movie into real technology, this incredible effort to build the movie. So coming out of that, then, the National Academies had asked me to advise their program on public communication of science. So I went to DC in the Grand Building, had a very formal day with very impressive people. And at the end of the day, I didn't say anything intimidated by the weight of all of this. And at the end of the day, I finally screwed up my courage to say, you must be joking, because the whole day was about pamphlets. The whole day was about the pamphlets they're going to print and which pamphlets they're going to print. And so I said, that's crazy. These pamphlets just aren't going to have an impact. But I know some cool people in Hollywood. Do you want to go have a visit? And so that led to, with the National Academies, with Suzanne and then with colleagues at ICT, we ran a meeting on science in Hollywood. And the dramatic outcome was the movie makers said, gasp, you would actually talk to us? We didn't think you would want to talk to us. And the scientists said, gasp, you would actually want to talk to us? We didn't think you would want to talk to us. There was this, each side assumed the other wouldn't want to talk to them. But one of the key insights, which is at the heart of Science Entertainment Exchange, and I really attribute to Alex, is you don't need the scientists to do the story. The storytellers are good storytellers. What you need them for is the backstory. What are the words that go with what's happening behind you? There's a really cool moment on set on Minority Report where people are running around in the tears, and Steven stopped everything to say, what's that person doing there? Because you can't just pretend to run around. You actually have to understand what function you're doing. And so creating compelling backstory is at the heart, and it's great content. It's much better than what just somebody could make up. And it fills popular media with really good science content, the great work that the Exchange has done. So looking forward, the program I run, CBA, it was created to study the boundary between digital and physical. I never understood that interface. I'm proud to be attributed to saying computer science was the worst thing to happen to computers or to science because it's unphysical. And so we've done things like the first faster than classical quantum computations, part of the birth of Internet of Things, part of collaborations in creating synthetic life. And one of the core things that's come out of that research is a roadmap up to the replicator, that in the same way computing went from 1 to 1,000 to 1,000,000 to 1,000,000,000 to 1,000,000,000,000. MIT made the first computerized manufacturing machine in 1952. It led to machines making things, then work on machines making machines, and then assemblers and self-assemblers. And all of those things are happening today in the lab, but it ranges from impact today to decades in the future, leading up to the replicator roadmap. And there's been a really interesting interplay. We've had a number, as the science really gets ahead of the science fiction, we've had a number of really interesting science fiction authors come to learn about science reality to bring back into the fiction, sort of the causality going backwards. So then, given that parallel between computing, because today we're at the equivalent of the birth of the internet stage for this parallel in communication, computation, now fabrication. For the National Science Foundation, we started an outreach program setting up community fabrication labs, mini versions of the big lab at MIT, but big versions of what'll fit in your pocket in the future, these fab labs. We set up one with a grand old man of community activism in Boston, Mel King. We thought we'd go back to work, and they accidentally went viral. There's about 2,000 now in 125 countries. They double every roughly year and a half, what's come to be called Lass's Law after Sherry Lassiter. And coming out of that is ultimately a new vision of how you create technology in society. I'm showing bonus material for the movie The Martian, where instead of having to do the whole industrial revolution on Mars, you essentially create life in non-living materials to bootstrap a civilization. That's bonus material for the movie The Martian. Back on Earth, we have a Fab City program working on cities being able to produce what they consume. So to teach the skills to do that, DARPA funded my lab and Alan's company Eline to do Fab the Game. And the idea was to teach the skills for this world of digital fabrication and design. My team wanted to make just a VR version of the lab as it exists today. Alan's designer said that was boring. His designers wanted to make this crazy scheme of, far in the future, and you're in a hyperspace jump and your turbo drive quantum crystals have fractured. And we said, that doesn't make any sense. And it forced both of us to meet in the middle. It forced us to take seriously, where would this lead if we succeeded, beyond what we're going to do next week. It forced the designers to ask, what is actually physically realizable? And collaborations like that finally grew into the book I wrote with Joel and Alan, Designing Reality. Normally, when I would give a talk about the research we're doing, people are excited and clap and say, that's very exciting. And if you listen carefully in the back, you could hear Joel and Alan groaning. And they're groaning because they believe I'm right about the technology, but they think I'm being very naive about how technology comes out in society. And in the same way, libertarian computing designers didn't anticipate spam, fake news, and income inequality. The same thing risks happening today. And so we wrote this book to look at, if we're heading towards 50 years of scaling bits to atoms, how do we shape it today rather than waiting for all the things that can go wrong? And so with that, I'll hand off to Alan, who did not get the technology genes in the family.
Thanks, Neil. It is true, Neil took all the technology genes before I was born. So when I first learned about the Science and Entertainment Exchange, I thought this is awesome, amazing scientists working with amazing filmmakers. But I did ask, what about video games, which are possibly the most powerful medium in the world when you think about the billions of hours of lean forward engagement. And both mediums are powerful. They're powerful in different ways. Before I come back to Fab to the game, I'll talk a little bit about what's unique about games as opposed to linear media. And I'll talk about it from two perspectives: play to learn and make to learn. In terms of play to learn or play for impact, games are invitational. You take on a role and identity. It might be a scientist, an adventurer, all sorts of different identities. You step into an interesting role. You go into a problem space. You have challenges. And crucially, you have agency. You have agency to tackle those challenges. Games are about verbs. They can be action verbs as well as thinking verbs. And as you act, and this is something that people often miss, the failure is fun. It's evocative and safe. But crucially, you get feedback. You get feedback from the game. You get feedback from peers. You get feedback from mentors, from the community, to level up towards a goal that you're invested in. Now, often these goals are just playful goals as the designers have designed them, but they could be amazing real world goals, like imagining possible futures. When I look at the media landscape right now, I see a lot of dystopian future storytelling, whether it's movies, TV, video games, novels. It's astounding. And I think it speaks to a lot of the zeitgeist in the world. But I think it's essential that we balance the dystopian visions of the future with evocative, aspirational, but achievable visions. So we have collective visions that we can then build the stable steps towards urging into existence, which brings us to the make to learn side of games. Games are not only are they interactive from a play space, but increasingly games are about making things. If you look about two of the most popular games in the world, Minecraft and Roblox, reaching hundreds of millions of youths, hundreds of billions of hours of deeply engaged creation, and the modding of games. Most games these days are moddable. So the idea that you are not only in a play space, but a make space, and imagining and building these possible futures is a largely untapped potential. So when Neil talks about the very powerful third digital revolution in digital fabrication, one could build dystopian futures of bad people making bad things, of great, only certain people having access to these powerful technologies. But there also could be amazing aspirational visions, which you'll hear from Blair and other visions of how this technology can truly democratize the means for production. But we need to visualize those futures. We need to narrativize those futures to enable people to collectively urge them into existence. And that was the idea behind Fab the game. So in terms of unpacking the positive, mitigating risk and maximizing the positive, I'll hand it to my brother, Joel.
Thanks, Alan.
And sorry, just in transition, Alan, I think it's worth really briefly mentioning those two met in a great collaboration with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council in Alaska that has great cultural traditions and terrible challenges. And we helped them set up Fab Labs to use modern tools with traditional craft. And Alan helped create a video game studio to do Alaska Native storytelling through the medium. I think is a great example that was lurking on your slide.
Yeah, just one note on that. I mean, as we look to the future, it's important to also look to the timeless practices and values of the past that have sustained cultures for years, things like interdependence and sustainability. So it's a good point.
Good, Joel.
And I'll actually come back to that in a minute. But today I'd like to talk about the intersection of world building and social science. And in particular, what if teams, organizations, and even institutions were agile, adaptive, and inclusive as they co-evolve with accelerating technologies? That's essentially where I'd like to go with my comments today. But I'd like to start with the picture that you see in the upper right-hand corner of Dominique. I took this picture 18 years ago in the very first Fab Lab that Neil and Mel King launched in the South End of Boston. And what's important about this is three things. First, you see the joy in making, and we're going to talk about that in various ways, and you'll hear more about that from Blair. But second, I'm told that she is now a graduate student in engineering, but we're not sure. And that's the third thing, which is the not sure. What you see next to her is a report that I helped to co-author a year ago for the National Science Foundation on the missing millions that are not currently involved in research, computing, and data, but who could be and should be, and whose voices need to be heard. And so as a nation, we have what people call a STEM challenge around the folks who are not part of the technology conversation. And when you hear from Kim, you'll hear about some of the federal efforts to be more inclusive. The NSF is one of many federal agencies that are trying to advance equity in new and deeper ways. But if we go underneath the picture of Dominique, you'll see the sort of directory to the world build that was done with the University of Alaska, which Alex led and I had the honor to be part of. And you can't see it, but one of the nodes on the map that you can explore did involve a network of fab labs that were locally self-sufficient, cutting dependence on global supply chains. And we'll hear more about that from Blair. But if you look next to the Missing Millions report is an article that Alan, Neil, and I wrote for the Sloan Management Review called The Promise of Self-Sufficient Production. And here we really pose the question in this third digital revolution, following digital computation and communication with digital fabrication, what would it look like in terms of the social systems as well as the technology for people to be more self-sufficient? The last thing that I'd like to talk about is to really interrogate those organizational forms. I lead a group called the Stakeholder Alignment Collaborative. I co-lead it with a number of folks who are amazing. And we've been studying the multi-stakeholder consortia that are associated with research data and computing. We argued in the article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review that you see illustrated to the far left, that you don't solve a grand societal challenge with a big complex organizational structure. You start with something that's small, agile, and adaptive, and we have that align, act together, and separately adjust model so people can accomplish together what they can't do separately. And what you see in sort of a wallpaper below on the slide are a set of multi-stakeholder consortia that I've helped and worked with over the years, either helping to facilitate launch or sustainment. And the reason that they're there is really a 400-year story. If we go back to the 18th century, the dominant organizational and institutional form was the guild or the craft organization. If we go to the 19th century, we see the rise of the hierarchy and mass production. In the 20th century, we see the rise of the global multinational, multi-divisional institutional form. And I'm arguing that the 21st century will be marked by multi-stakeholder consortia that cross organizational and institutional lines. In fact, the Science Exchange is a multi-stakeholder consortia, and our own counting of the emergence of these in science is that they are increasing by an order of magnitude in the last 20 years, that multiple stakeholders come together to accomplish together what they can't do separately. And frankly, the challenges that our society faces cross organizational and institutional lines. And with the accelerating technologies that we've been talking about, the need for this is not only crucial, but in fact, institutions have to be adaptive in more agile ways because the pace of change is accelerating. So with that, I think we can go back to Alex to sort of bring us back home with the whole idea of world building.
Thanks, Joel. I'm getting way too much screen time, obviously, here. I think you can hear in everything that Neil and Alan and Joel have been saying that world building has another side of the coin. It's not just a backstory and a foundation, which has been essential for entertainment media, but it is a way of creating change. And since we started the notion of world building is two words, as opposed to the kind of game semantic of world building as a single word. the difference has been this evolution towards narrative design systems, which is really storytelling, system design and systems, systems and design itself, and using that as a powerful force for change. So this combination of story as imagination, with design as the implementation of something that can be executed and produced, and a system which we use as foundationally this idea of a holistic system where all of the notion, all the parts of storytelling connect in this circle you see here, which we call the mandala, but is also fundamental to the idea of collaboration and co-creation. So there's a few examples here. One you heard a little bit about in the video, Al-Baida, which was a project for a group of Bedouin, a tribe called Al-Baida, a village in Saudi. And the issue here was translation. And I think that where world building really was powerful was that it was combining this idea of storytelling and a visual narrative, that you could move from a tribe who didn't speak Arabic or English, but who could completely take control over their own their own future, looking at sustainable housing, looking at permaculture as a series of examples of both video and illustration, a way to dive into that world. In a very different way, and in a project that we're working on at the moment and have been for the last 3 years. In the top right here is a project called The World in a Cell. The challenge here was again one of translation. Dr. Ray Stevens at USC, who runs the Bridge Institute and is a molecular biologist, challenged us to say, how can storytelling create a new language for molecular biology? How can the idea that we can build and design a visual language allow this new system to be used for collaboration among scientists outside the ring of crystallography in molecular biology? And then how could it be used to translate out to a larger public? How could it be used to teach molecular biology in high schools, in undergrad and graduate, and in museums? So we worked very closely and continue to work in a completely integrated way with an art science group formed from the USC Bridge Institute and the amazing Dr. Helen Berman, who has been co-PI with me on this project. And we're building a system which is absolutely true to science, but is using a language which is fundamentally a system of systems, a series of tetrahedra, a single amino acid that can be multiplied. It's infinitely scalable and can be fit together in multiple ways on an edge, on a surface, on a point. There's almost nothing that you can't express with this tetrahedra. You also find, and because we put this immediately into virtual reality, that there had never been a time in history where proteins could be seen side by side, proteins and molecules. That the massive range of scale has never been possible to see essentially the scale between a mouse and a mountain in a single space. Now you can go into VR and experience this relationship. And now we're trying to get more and more science-based and more scientifically accurate. And the next stage of this is to allow scientists to go in to question these models and derive data from them. Completely different project. We're working with the Cook Inlet Tribal Council, the Alaskan Indigenous group connected to 200 tribes in Alaska. And we have been looking at the future of youth connected to 10,000 years of innovation, and yet not being clear about how they could move their story forward into the future. And this represents a look at the future of work and the future of resources, and connects directly to the University of Alaska project that Joel mentioned. In the bottom is a project we've been doing with Ford called the City of Tomorrow and the Living Street. And the idea here was to place us on the ground, the human relationship, see the human relationship between the intelligent city and the intelligent vehicle and infrastructure, and how can the human be absolutely at the center of that and be driving both sides. We've been looking at climate change and building 5 cities 50 years in the future for the American Society of Civil Engineers. In this case, we are looking towards this aspirational future. We're using imagination to extrapolate forward. 50 years is a fair way out to consider what the reality would be for civil engineers, but it's designed to be a provocation machine. It's designed to take into account climate change primarily, but also the massive shift in technology, the massive shift in the needs for engineering. If the water level rises a foot, the entire coastline of the world changes. The engineer is sort of central, civil engineer, to the way that the world is going to be developed in the future. So this bottom image is of a sustainable city on the ocean, a floating city, imagining that it is more sustainable to move out to the ocean than to move inland. And then finally, in the image above that is what we're calling a mega city. It continues to be a project with the Association of Civil Engineers, American Civil Engineers, looking at a massive city. And in this case now fully interactive. This provocation machine allows engineers to go in the education space and in the institutional space of the civil engineers, 145,000 people looking at their own future now, to move in and to question the world, to see this model that we've built that is embedded with questions and provocations that allow the engineers to go into this world and derive a massive amount of data, all of which is designed to make them think differently about the future. And to the
Sorry,
right
Alex,
there,
if I could just intrude for time to stay on schedule, we need to go to Blair.
yeah, sorry. Okay, I've said quite enough.
Sorry to intrude. So I'm delighted to then introduce Blair, who's doing remarkable work right at the intersection of making and world building. Blair.
Thank you. Drawn a lot of inspiration from a lot of folks on the panel, so it's a pleasure to join you. I guess a little bit of a ramp up the backstory. A lot of my formative years were in the context of the Black church in Detroit. And although I'm not a deeply religious person, it is a very kind of pragmatic core institution with food co-ops and repair programs and other sorts of things. So I had been involved in kind of community institution building in different ways. I went off to MIT, did a little computer stuff, some engineering stuff, some complex systems dynamic stuff, circled back around and had some kind of success in entrepreneurship and decided to really explore what self-sufficiency, resilience would kind of look like. So I did the farm thing, grow your own food, harvest your own energy, and found out that it was feasible, but extraordinarily hard work and not something everyone was going to do. I got involved in education and developed some experiential curriculum for students in Detroit, and really found that if people have access to the means of production to be able to create things, their sense of agency shifts. We were technically dealing with what people called kind of at-risk youth, which were very bright kids who decided to disconnect for several reasons. And so if they're given the means to be able to actually create things that they can imagine, then their mentality kind of shifts from one of scarcity and competition to kind of abundance and creation. And there's a very empowering experience. We started with kind of natural environment things, some permaculture, creating aquaponic systems, et cetera. I've been keeping an eye on this Fab Lab thing out of the corner of my eye. And so shot off an email to Lass and asked about starting a Fab Lab. She pointed me to the website. I ordered all the equipment and sent an email back, said I'm ready to go. So signed up for Neil's course and kind of figured out what Fab Labs are really about. And it's extraordinarily high leverage kind of component of what we've been doing. So we have worked with young folks involved in both natural environment things and digital fabrication, creating transportation or housing structure examples. And it was extremely empowering. And we wanted to take it another step and really think about if we kind of disconnected people from all the things they hate doing, but they have to in order to get by. And if people could focus their creative energy on doing the things that were meaningful to themselves, their family, their community, what might that look like? So we started experimenting with that a bit and ran into difficulties, and that you can't do that because of this, and this political structure doesn't allow you to do it, and this regulatory structure doesn't allow you to do it, and who are you all to do this kind of organizational structure? And so we kind of started trying to figure out how can we organize ourselves to be more successful with this. So we ventured off into some non-traditional areas, and that kind of shifted me in the direction of where we are right now, which is Idlewild, Michigan, which is a historic African-American community that's got deep roots for over 100 years in the United States. It was just nominated as a National Historic Landmark, but it has a history really involved in self-sufficiency, self-determination, self-reliance that was forged during times of segregation. But really ideas of coopetition and all those kind of things were really in play here for a very long period of time. It's a very vibrant community. If you look up Idlewild, Michigan, it's got a very interesting history. When the laws changed for more equal access, a lot of the things that forced people to be within a community kind of dissipated. And so it kind of skipped a generation or so, but people are coming back because there was a missing aspect of being able to work within community and spend your time for things that you found were very valuable. And so we are in the process of working with people who are coming back to the community or in the community to kind of think about what thriving really means and looks like, and what are pathways for people who are divorced from access to a lot of the normal resource base to perhaps use what's at their disposal to create what they want. So having access to what Neil talks about in terms of universal or ubiquitous digital fabrication is really kind of about equally distributing the means of production and creation within everyone's capacity. And so we're not there now, but keeping an eye on this technology curve as the brothers laid out well in the book. It's actually coming. And we're talking about building kind of these human systems which aren't on the same exponential curve as these technology systems. So it's going to take us a long time to get there. And so we're actually kind of behind. However, we're trying to intercept something that we know is coming. And if you're a gearhead, you might believe that. But a lot of other folks, that's kind of a really foreign concept, which brings me to my interest in the whole world building piece. Because what we find the most is that when people dwell in this and spend some time, they really recognize that this is a potential game changer, and it's worth thinking about how we will reorganize ourselves around that. However, the majority of people are struggling to see what a day, week, month in the life of someone would be if the circumstance changed where you had access to technology that allowed you to use indigenous resources to create the things that you needed, energy, durable goods, or whatever. And so to be able to kind of, again, conceptualize that is one of the key hurdles that we're dealing with, in addition to, how do you motivate around aspirational thinking for things which are just coming into foggy kind of visibility. So what I wanted to kind of discuss a little bit in the world building area, that's not an area that we have great expertise, although we are doing a lot of great on the ground work. One of the key things is people see futures in the context of some major, an asteroid hit or climate change clobbered, or they had a nuclear war. And there are too many variables that changed at the same time for someone to identify with that future. How could we create a scenario where people could visualize what the present in with a few changes, like access to digital fabrication, and how that might allow people to reorganize our social structure to be able to then own our own time in ways that we can't now, and to find, justification and value in experiences and relationships instead of the grind and shiny blingy things. So that's the thing I wanted to the question I wanted to bring to this distinguished group Is there a way to do a more current reality-based version of this aspirational future that doesn't involve some imaginary calamity?
And before we dive in on Blair's really important question, I'd like to hear also from Kim. Kim is a national policy and thought leader on issues of equity in organizations and institutions. What is not as well known, I know her through the work at the program on negotiation at the Harvard Law School, is she's also very thoughtful about improvisation in negotiation. And I'm wondering, Kim, if you might react to this world building through not just a lens of equity, but also a lens of improvisation.
Well, hi, everybody, and thank you, Joel. Certainly, this has been a fascinating exchange, and it's also terrific to meet Joel's brothers, as well as everyone else on this call. So when I think about world building, I think a lot about policy making, actually, because from where I sit, thinking about policy, we're thinking about how to create the worlds we want communities to enjoy. We try to think about the lives that people might be able to live if, for instance, their government was producing equitable outcomes in communities, or if education were readily available to all in ways that allow their talents to grow and to shine and for people to it. But that's what we do all the time. When the interesting thing about that is when we think about work that we've been doing through an executive order that President Biden issued about a year ago on equity, we've realized that we can sit in our offices and on our Zoom rooms, and we can begin to determine what the particular ingredients might be for a world in which people might thrive. But if we leave out the people themselves, and if we don't invite them to co-create the story with us, then our story will always be incomplete. And to make the connection to the media, I think about the fact that with all policy, there are always unintended consequences. We just usually don't take the time to play out what they will be. We stick to our preferred stories and our preferred characters, and we forget about the characters on the fringes who may wind up throwing off that story down the line. And when we think about it in the world of movie making, we could think about Jurassic Park. We create a world and then that world turns out to bite us back. And one of my favorite book titles is When Things Bite Back. When I think also, though, about movies and cinema, I think about a world like Wakanda that exists within the world we can see, but where a different kind of thriving is also possible with different stories. So in this notion of world building and the technology that's needed, I would argue that a really critical part of it is not just the worlds we build for others, but it's also the co-creation of worlds, which is, I think, what you're talking about with gamers. That's not a world I myself know personally, but to imagine that you have some of the pieces of that new world. And if you're entrusted with trying to put it together, and if you have to work with partners, that's where the improvisation would come in. How do you trade off ideas back and forth? How do you make trade-offs back and forth? How do you get certain things done now and hope you'll be able to accomplish other things later or not? So I think there's an important narrative story here that links the world that all of you are doing with that of public policy making when we think about it in the abstract. In the guts of an executive order or a regulation, maybe you don't think of world building. But when people are standing around that whiteboard or they're on a Zoom room and they're saying, what is the world we want for Americans, for kids in our cities, for kids in STEM programs? That's where I think we begin to see some of the design elements of policy that are so resonant with what you all are talking about today.
Great. Rick, do you want to guide Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do it like this, if it's okay with you guys, just so that we don't get the Brady Bunch screen. I think for the whole panel, I'm not sure who would be the perfect person, maybe Neil or Alex. We got a question from Janet. Is there enough of an archive from the past to sort of see how close we saw the future, meaning now, in the past? Do you guys have a sense of that?
Well, let's see. My 1 minute answer is, for the kinds of things I described, I'm making bold predictions about the present. So slightly overused, but William Gibson famously said, the future is here today, but not uniformly distributed. And that's what exactly I'm doing. I'm not making predictions. The future is here today, but it's not widely distributed for the kinds of things I described. Alex?
Yeah, I think my 1 minute answer is that I think world building is an arc from the past to the future. There is no future without a really deep understanding of how we got here. I would suggest that the present doesn't exist, actually, because we're constantly moving forward in the future. But I don't think it works if you get this idea of futurists, very different than world building, which is that you're actually building a world which is based on deep knowledge. So absolutely, they are inextricably connected.
So I think the next question is for Joel and possibly Kimberlin too. Someone was asking about the background I had with a vertically integrated garden in cities, basically, and they were wondering how easy that is to implement and whether or not it's difficult, when you run into cities and bureaucracies and things. How hard is it to implement these future visions of cities? Sorry, this question's from Hannah.
Yeah, no, I know Kim will also want to comment. We both come from a world where we assume stakeholders have both common and competing interests. And so it will be a negotiated interaction. Alan said earlier that too many of the future visions of the world are dystopian. I will also say that some of them are overly utopian in the sense that they assume everyone is holding hands and singing Kumbaya together. When we think about how to build a future world, imagine one where people deeply disagree, but also have constructive mechanisms to engage those issues in productive ways.
And Joe, I have to say as a footnote, a microcosm is the three of us writing the book where we deeply disagreed. It was a miserable experience, but we found constructive ways.
I actually love the experience, but Kim, you might also want to say about the negotiated dynamic about deeply competing values, principles, and ideologies.
No, absolutely. Negotiation, in the sense that you're describing it, Joel, is absolutely the case when people come together because they have different ideas about the world they're living in now, even if the present doesn't exist, let alone the world they want to live in the future. The other point I would say, and I think this is critical, and it goes back to essentially the stakeholder comment that I made earlier, is that sometimes we don't recognize the worlds that people have already built, the expertise that they have already deployed. It may not look the same in different communities. It may not be familiar to us. I think about where my grandmother grew up in the lower 9th Ward of New Orleans. Not very many resources, but if you look past the surface, you would see people who were deeply connected to one another and who had been able to survive a great many things before Hurricane Katrina and survive well by relying on one another. And that's the kind of connectivity that we also need to pay attention to.
I think this question might be best answered by Blair and or Neil. The question is, what are the risks of science and entertainment partnering to manipulate the priorities of technology creation above real applications to solve real world problems of inequity, poverty, and climate change, et cetera? And what is the ethical responsibility of these types of partnerships?
Blair, do you want to start?
I'm looking forward to media manipulating people's minds into some constructive visions of the future. I mean, it's just evil. There's a constructive aspect of this also. And I think people need an opportunity to see some different ways that they could operate in order for it to be something tangible that they're willing to work towards. So I'm willing to take the risk of the negative side to try to get the positive side.
And then picking up first, I want to note, Blair asked a huge important question that I think is really a homework assignment. Blair's question about how do we marry everything we're talking about, we're not going to do in the next 4 minutes. I think this whole program is an invitation to spend the next few months with Blair, working through Blair's question to do justice to it. Quickly, Rick, we've run these labs in shooting war zones, in religious conflict, sectarian conflict, at boundaries with refugee camps, at all kinds of red, blue states, everywhere you can think of. And what's really interesting about them is while those head-to-head battles are being fought, this is sort of an end run around it. What isn't getting covered is this is an alternative to fighting those battles. And there's wonderful stories. Some of them we tell in the book about these parts of the world where people see disaster and battle and they don't see the people over here using these tools to really invent a different future. And what's important is they're leaky. There aren't real points of control to shut them down. And further, people who should be threatened by them, who don't realize how disruptive they are, don't realize how disruptive they are. And so that's why I'm pretty hopeful that there isn't sort of a grand overarching something that'll shut this down.
I love that note to end on, but I don't think that Alan got a question in this Q&A segment. So I just want to make sure that Alan gets one. So we have a question from Janet about, you mentioned Roblox as an example of collaborative building, but Janet was concerned about whether or not the life lessons are actually more transactional than that. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, there are lots of different ways to tackle the question. But I'll turn it into a thought experiment that ties into the last thread that Neil and Blair talked about, which is, Roblox is amazing at helping kids become creators, not just consumers, and doing it in a social context, and they're very good at that. But Roblox wasn't designed for people to reflect on what is a metaverse, what could a metaverse be, to ask the what if, why not world building questions. So I'll turn the question into a thought experiment that could perhaps address the broader question that came up from Blair, which is, if world building were taught in schools at every age group, if there were environments like Roblox and Minecraft that provided the scaffolding around helping youth debate, discuss the what if, why not questions of what we want this metaverse to be, and whether that's even the right terminology, given where it came from, I think you would start to get very interesting visions of the future. And perhaps that 8-year-old would have a really thoughtful conversation with the father around what is the metaverse and where is it going. Games don't teach, they're more an invitation to learn. And often that invitation is discussions around the experience. So it was a great question, and I think it's a great prompt for where we could go.
There's 2 minutes left. Can I suggest we each do a 30-second wrap up, but only 30 seconds?
Absolutely.
So why don't we do it just in the order we presented? Alex?
Yeah, I think that when we talk about storytelling, storytelling is not a Western tradition. Storytelling is a tribal tradition. And I think we've absolutely forgotten that it is not a single author that tells stories, it's a collaborative group. And so I think that is underlying fundamental to world building. That's why it doesn't turn utopian, dystopian. And it's also a vertical slice. When you're talking about a story, you're slicing into a world. It's infinitely scalable, and the most powerful stories happen at the street corner level. That's where we can actually gather around something and create change, and then it extrapolates out.
Great. I'll pick up with something I said at the first Science and Entertainment Exchange, and nobody had any idea what I was talking about, which is the Science Entertainment Exchange assumes you can tell the difference between a scientist and a non-scientist. And all of these tools are democratizing not just making, but science. In fact, we're running a meeting with NIST and DOE on open metrology later this year. And so if anybody can become a scientist, there's great challenges, but even greater opportunities to not communicate science. And this picks up on Nick's question, to not just communicate from scientist to non-scientist, but empower people to become scientists. And that, for me, the Science Entertainment Exchange has succeeded at the first epoch. This is the next epoch. Alan?
Well, to build on where I left off, I think world building as a practice should be in elementary school, middle school, high school, continuing ed. It is a remarkable practice. It's a social practice. And I think it will enable us to create these collective, evocative, aspirational, but achievable visions of the future.
Great, Joel.
When I facilitate the launch of these multi-stakeholder consortia, what amazes me is people can write a charter and a vision and go out and do things, and there's no place that you have to register or sign up. And so as we think about a world in which people are learning to do world building, the amazing thing is that they can then build these social systems that go with the technical systems and do so on their own. And in fact, to build the kind of future that we would all like to be part of. And
then over Blair and then Kim to wrap up.
Oh, yeah, I guess I would say I see a tremendous number of people who are completely frustrated with a lot of the way things are working right now and are very active in moving away from something, but they don't know. They know what they don't like about what's going on, and they know kind of what they would like about something in the future, but they don't know what it might feel like. So I think it's really critically important, given this time period where people know they need to do something different, to have something concrete that they can kind of visualize on what that might look and feel like.
And last word from Kim.
I would just speak to the importance of curiosity. And curiosity is most important when you are actually not interested in what the other person has to say. That's when you need curiosity, because if you're listening to someone and you care about what they're saying, you're already interested. So if listening is important to storytelling, we also have to make sure that we are curious when people tell us what they've heard from the stories we tell.
All right, with that, I want to thank all of our speakers today. Thank you so much for coming. I want to thank everybody who asked a question. We had over 40 of them and 5 minutes to answer. I want to thank everybody who donated to this event, especially those who joined who donated at the supporter level. We can't do these events without you. And I want to thank Courtney Sloan, Sachi Gerben, Jeff Fishman, Amechi Ukpabi, and everybody who helped us technically produce this event. We're off next week. We'll be back in 2 weeks for Science Diplomacy with Bill Cole Glazier. It's going to be a great event. Thank you very much. We'll see you in 2 weeks.